Chapter 3, Environmental History, Politics, and Economics. It's a little bit important in my mind to at least understand some of the history that got us from where we used to be to where we are. And certainly we can't make changes without there being changes first in the policy or the laws, and then enforcing those laws, and that drives change. So worldwide governments have struggled somewhat to develop climate change policies. The biggest issue, as we've already touched on a little bit, is how do we shift from depending on fossil fuels to depending on alternative energy sources like solar, wind, etc. And then, putting large enough solar farms or wind farms out there takes a lot of space. So, like anything else that we build, there's always a trade-off. If we build a 1,000-acre solar farm in Southern California, what's that area going to replace? Does it interfere with wildlife habitat? Does it, as we already mentioned, make the area less aesthetically pleasing? The not in my backyard, I don't want to have to see it. And does it, or could it contribute to other problems like noise pollution? Obviously, solar panels don't make noise, and wind turbines generally don't make noise. But as we make these changes, we have to address all of these social, political, and economic perspectives. Excuse me. So the chart there shows the renewable energy in select countries as of 2010. And China leads the way, but they also have a huge population, followed by the US, Germany, Spain, and Japan, just to kind of name the top 5. So again, we in the United States have made a lot of progress in this process of developing renewable energy sources and developing policy that directs us to do that. But, as I also mentioned, we still have a long ways to go. So this whole class really talks about conserving resources. So what is a resource? It's any part of the natural environment that's used to promote the welfare of people or any of the other living things on the planet. So these resources come from the earth, and again, whether they're living things like trees that we cut down to make wood out of, or they're things like coal that's underground that we dig up to burn to keep us warm. But all of those are resources that come from this planet. And so then what's conservation? Well, oftentimes people confuse or mix up the words conservation and preservation. So I've used the word conservation a few times already in the last 2 chapters. Conservation, as your book defines it, is the sensible and careful management of our natural resources. I might also say it's the wise use of our resources. So bottom line is conservation involves using resources to meet our needs, but using them wisely. And things like terracing farmland to prevent erosion, strip cropping like we see in this image, or using whatever the best technology is, are all just a few examples of conservation. Again, we need food, so we've got to devote some land to agriculture, but we should do it in a wise manner, use it sustainably. We need wood, so we have to devote some land to growing trees. And again, as long as we're managing them wisely, we're conserving them. Compare that to the term preservation, which means setting aside land in an undisturbed area. So leaving land without touching it, without using it, without managing it. The idea here is that we're trying to maintain this land in what is termed a pristine state. Although, honestly, there's very little land on this planet that is truly pristine, meaning that it looks exactly like it did, let's say 300 years ago, before there were as many of us on this planet. Unfortunately, we have there are enough of us on this planet that we've had a pretty profound impact on just about every square inch of the planet, to some degree anyway. But again, we set certain types of land aside and protect them from human activities that might otherwise alter their natural state. So for example, our national parks, like the Grand Canyon National Park, Yosemite National Park, are lands that are set aside or preserved for us to look at, but not for us to manage or use the resources off of them. So going back more than 100 years, going back to the 1800s, there's always been these two sides sort of debating on what we should do. The people that are more about preservation versus those that are more about conservation. So again, I think it's important not to spend a lot of time, but to at least spend a little time kind of outlining our environmental history so you understand how we got to where we are today. So we talked a little bit earlier in the class about the idea that we settled this country and basically saw it as a bunch of resources that we should conquer and use however we wanted to. And that idea, that philosophy, definitely was what we were focused on for about the first 200 years that we settled this country. So from the 1600s through the 1800s, we had this frontier attitude of conquering nature and using those resources to profit from them, cutting down trees and selling the wood to make money. It was also about using the resources to build our society, of course. We wouldn't probably be the country we are if we didn't have so many natural resources to use. But we later realized that the amount of destruction we were doing was definitely not sustainable in the long run. Again, it took us a couple hundred years to realize that, but we eventually did. And that's when developing those policies and laws took effect that kind of push us forward to where we are today with laws like the Endangered Species Act, Forest Protection Act, Air and Water Quality Acts, that now basically have a framework that is used to prevent further damaging our environment. So it wasn't until fairly modern time for us, and probably even more recently for other countries like Bolivia, where they started focusing more on thinking about preserving land rather than just using it as a money-making opportunity. So there are a handful of people that your book highlights who had a fairly important impact in protecting land in the past. John James Audubon in the late 17 to mid 1800s. You might recognize that name from, say, the Audubon bird books, the field guides that help you identify birds. He basically cataloged all of the birds and even other animals of North America and painted them in this very large book that you can find copies of in libraries. But it was basically his role to document all the different birds and other animals that we have here in this country. Writers like Henry David Thoreau through the 1800s were folks who advocated lifestyles being simplistic. Remember we talked about voluntary simplicity in a previous chapter? There were people even back in the 1800s, long before most people ever thought there would be a problem. There were people like Thoreau that were advocating that we maintain a simplistic lifestyle, be in touch with nature and not do things that damage the environment. Again, it's really important to think about that. Do you think most people living in the mid-1800s worried about running out of trees, or ever worried about a day when the water might not be available, or when there might not be enough land to grow food? Not really. So there were people, fortunately, like Thoreau, that were talking about that back then. And I would argue that if it wasn't for them, we might have had much, much greater problems than we had. And then George Perkins Marsh in the 1800s, who wrote about man and nature and identified us as humans, that we are a very potentially important agent of environmental change. So again, even in the 1800s, there were people that recognized we as humans on this planet could impact the environment negatively. Along with these people, of course, there had to be groups, organizations like the American Forestry Organization back in 1875, where there were citizens that joined this group because they were worried about the destruction of our forests. Again, at a time when most people didn't know or didn't care. And then a little later, some of the first laws and policies that were put in place to deal with our diminishing forests. Among the most important of all policies since then was the Forest Reserve Act of 1891, which basically gave the president authority to establish reserves, forest reserves on federal land. So initially, these were more like our national parks today. They were forested lands that were set aside and preserved, not used for harvesting timber. And so Presidents Harrison, Cleveland, McKinley, Teddy Roosevelt together set aside about 43 million acres of forest over their presidency. Later, because of a lot of different people providing input, that act was modified, creating what is now our national forests. And it required that Congress had to be involved in establishing national forests. So basically, it was no longer possible that a president could just make a forest reserve. It took an act of Congress. And actually it was Teddy Roosevelt, that signed that bill into law. Also at that time, Gifford Pinchot was appointed then to be the first head of the new U.S. Forest Service, which is the agency that manages our national forests still today. So this was kind of a key turning point because it moved from the idea that we need to set aside all of our forests so they can never be cut down to an idea that, well, the reality is, and especially at that time, but even still today, that wood is a very important building block of our society. Now, of course, today we also know that if we manage it correctly, it's the ultimate renewable, reusable, sustainable product that we can possibly use for building and heating and everything else. But again, this was important because they acknowledged that we really shouldn't set all of the land aside and not touch it. We needed to manage conservatively our forests. Not all of them, but a lot of them, to still provide all the products that we as citizens need. We talked in the beginning of this chapter about conservation versus preservation. And these two guys were really at the forefront of that debate. Theodore Roosevelt on the left of this image and John Muir on the right. So it wasn't really called necessarily conservation and preservation at that time. It was more about what were called utilitarian conservationists, who believed that natural resources should be used, but used in a sustainable fashion. So this would have been the opinion by people like Teddy Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot. John Muir was sort of on the other side of that coin. He argued for this idea of biocentric preservation, that nature should be protected from human interference and that all forms of life have equal rights to their existence on this planet. In addition to Muir being a biocentrist, he also basically really pushed forward the bill that eventually developed Yosemite as a national park. And again, national parks are preserved. So really it was about striking a balance between setting some land aside and not touching it, preserving it, and using other land like our national forests, using them in a conservative fashion, meaning managing them wisely. John Muir was also responsible for founding the Sierra Club, which is, of course, still in existence today. Right around that same time, the early 1900s, the Antiquities Act was developed, which basically allowed for things like national monuments to be set aside by the president just declaring it to be so. And even though we had national parks, again, Yellowstone was the very first in the 1870s. By the early 1900s, we had a bunch of national parks, but we didn't have an agency to actually manage them or take care of them. Until 1916, it was basically the U.S. Army who was responsible for protecting areas like Yellowstone. Remember, in 1872, when Yellowstone was declared as a national park, it was a preserved area and later became officially called a national park, but it was still in the middle of wilderness. It was in the middle of nowhere. They wanted to make sure that people didn't just go there and start building homes or cutting down trees or shooting animals. So the park, the parks were protected by the Army. There was a base. The military would patrol the park boundaries and make sure that people weren't doing illegal activities. And so in 1916, finally, the National Park Service was established. And they basically were given the charge to preserve the land but allow for people to visit the land. So the Dinosaur National Monument was one of those areas under the Antiquities Act, Devil's Post Pile. All kinds of other areas were declared as monuments and so forth. But kind of going back to the Hetch Hetchy Valley, the image on the bottom right is what it looked like prior to the Hetch Hetchy Dam being built, and then the image above is showing it as a flooded reservoir. The conflict between taking an area within a national park, so this is in Yosemite, and building a dam in a national park seemed contrary to a lot of people, particularly people like John Muir. And so for quite a while he fought the building of a dam in Hetch Hetchy Valley. And eventually the politics and the economic side of the argument won out to the biological side, like we've talked about. Sometimes those issues are more important than the biology. And ultimately John Muir lost that fight. The economic that, cities like San Francisco were growing and developing, and we needed to supply them with water. And basically the Hetch Hetchy Dam and the reservoir is a water source that supplies the Bay Area. So again, we've had some conflicts going on even within parks and other areas on how they should be used. And even today there are groups that are fighting to even set aside more wilderness area than we already have, believing we can never have enough wilderness area. So those kinds of conflicts will certainly continue to occur. Moving ahead in time a little bit, other people that had very important roles in natural resources, conservation, people like the other Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, did a lot of things in the 1930s, like establishing the Civilian Conservation Corps. Remember, during this time, we were in the Great Depression. A lot of people were out of work. And so Roosevelt developed the Civilian Conservation Corps, which basically provided jobs to able-bodied men to do environmental work, fix road systems, put in infrastructure like telephone lines or electrical lines, replant trees, things that would benefit the environment. So these men were paid for their work. They could send the money back home so that they could pay the bills and keep their home and feed their families. And yet, of course, did really good things for the environment during a time when the economy wasn't doing so well. He also established the Soil Conservation Service because of the Depression, the economic problems. A lot of farms were being abandoned because the farmers couldn't pay their bills. So leaving a farm abandoned, we also had a drought, so no water. Basically, all the worst things came together and caused a lot of soil erosion that did a lot of damage. So Roosevelt established the Soil Conservation Service to train people to help those farmers and ranchers manage their land so that it could maintain productivity. Got people like Aldo Leopold, who's pictured on this slide, who's the father of wildlife management. He wrote a number of books, including Game Management and a Sand County Almanac, that were written for average people, not scientists. He was an avid hunter and eventually kind of got away from that and spent a lot of time of his life advocating for managing wildlife, sort of like Gifford Pinchot becoming the head of the Forest Service and advocating for wise use of our forests. Leopold was the equivalent for the wildlife out there. And then Stegner, who lived throughout the 1900s, his essay on wilderness in 1962, which ultimately influenced the creation of the Wilderness Act. Remember, the Forest Service was created way back in even the 1800s, as was the Park Service. But the Wilderness Act wasn't established until 1964. So by 1964, a lot of areas of wilderness were already gone, or they were already used for something else. So it's kind of one of those things, better late than never. But without people like Stegner, we might not have ever had a specific legislation that protected wilderness areas. Other very influential people like Rachel Carson she was a biologist for the Fish and Wildlife Service, I believe, and wrote a book called Silent Spring. I would suggest to you that getting a copy of Silent Spring, getting a copy of Aldo Leopold's Sand County Almanac, and just reading those when you have time. They're easy to read. They're great perspectives on our views and challenges with the environment during a time when we were doing a lot of damage and we didn't realize just how bad we were messing up the environment. And so people like Rachel Carson were the very first people that started telling the average citizen about these problems, making them aware of things like DDT that we were using and how bad it was for the environment. Yes, it helped us grow better crops of food. It helped protect us from diseases, but it damaged the environment. And so, again, being able to make informed decisions. People like Rachel Carson were the connection between science and the average person who really didn't understand that at all. So from a systems perspective, you got to consider both the immediate effects of something, like a chemical like DDT, but also how it affects other places at other times, how things can happen over time, how the effects can be different over time, or how they can affect different living things differently. Again, we didn't have a lot of environmental awareness as a society prior to the 1960s. It was really that decade, thanks to people like Rachel Carson, who started making the average person aware of things. And then as we became aware of those things, we started telling our politicians we care about this stuff. And that if they didn't listen to us, we'd elect somebody else. So a lot of laws came into effect in the 60s and 70s that are still in effect today that ultimately helped us start protecting our environment. Paul Ehrlich wrote a book called The Population Bomb back in 1968. This was a book that basically warned us that if the human population keeps growing like it is, that we ultimately would destroy the planet. He and another fellow called Julian Simon were kind of critical of each other and had a number of arguments and debates. And there's a great DVD out there called A Population Bomb. And it's a great DVD that kind of talks about both sides of the issue. How much of the problem is humans, how much of the problem is other things, and just kind of looking at the ecological viewpoint versus the economic viewpoint. Looking at the long-term perspective versus the short-term perspective. So it's definitely one of those things worth viewing. And I believe I have it posted on the Moodle page for you to view as a YouTube. So please do view that. It's a great summary of the main issues. So as we got into the 60s, started learning more about the environment, and into the 70s, we started into this era of the environmental movement, where environmentalists who were concerned about the environment started becoming more educated and started doing something to fix the problem. You know, I have to say that I think the word environmentalist has taken almost a complete negative connotation in our society. People don't, I think, like to be called environmentalists unless they are one. And I think that's because we assume environmentalists are the people on the far side, the people that chain themselves to trees and you know, go out of their way to be heard. I would argue that anything that's in the world, there are people that are kind of in the middle of an issue, and they're way on one side of the issue, and they're way on the other side of an issue. I would hope that every one of you are an environmentalist. And what I mean by that is really what an environmentalist is just someone who cares about the environment. Hopefully every one of us cares about the environment. If you choose to be a real out there advocate and be the person that chains themselves to a tree to keep it from being cut down, you're more of an extreme environmentalist perhaps. Or if you're on the other end of the scale, you might give your $20 to the World Wildlife Fund and do nothing else. But again, I think all of us should be environmentalists from the perspective of just caring about the environment. So, a lot of people believe that the environmental movement actually started with our first Earth Day back in 1970. It was really the first time that we started thinking globally, but yet acting locally. And basically, it was a worldwide function where people from around the world gathered all on the same day around the world. It was the biggest organized activity that had ever occurred on the planet, all for the common purpose of educating people about things like recycling. We think of that as being something relatively new. But in the 70s, they were talking about recycling. More recently, the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, those things have been revised over time to accommodate new things that have come up. Around the world, there are other things going on, like the Green Belt movement in Kenya to develop habitat, basically. And the person who organized that, I'm not going to try and pronounce that name because I know I'll get it wrong, was actually awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for her work in Kenya. There's an environmental discovery called environmental literacy, which is an educational campaign about the environment to help people be able to make appropriate decisions. You can't really decide on something unless you understand it, right? Every year when we're asked to go vote for governors or presidents, we don't vote based on which name we like the best, although there is some of that. We should be voting on what their policies are, what they believe in. Or if we're voting for a new law, we should understand what that is and know the pros and the cons, and then make an educated decision. So it's kind of hard to make educated decisions about the environment if we don't understand the environment. It's at the point now where it's required in most states that students are getting environmental education right from the beginning, K through 6 and onward. Used to be that you might have a biology class or a chemistry class in high school, but it was all just about reading and writing and math, all the rest of the years you were in school, K through 12. And the only time you would get any kind of environmental education is if you went to college and if you chose a major that was environmental. So now we've come to realize, like anything else, if children aren't taught from the very beginning of their education about things, it doesn't come as naturally for them later. So there's lots of different programs that are listed in your book that deal with trying to educate younger people. In California, I am a member of the Society of American Foresters, and every year there are educational opportunities that we provide for younger kids. We used to do it over just in the Bay Area, where I believe it was either 6th or 8th grade students from around the Bay Area would come to this facility for several days, and they would just learn about the environment. It wasn't about just forestry or cutting down trees. It was environmental education. As probably you guys know, it's one thing to tell people about something, but it's a whole different thing when you can go out and actually be in it and see it. So getting kids into the environment and showing them and teaching them things is the best way of doing it. And that's a project that's funded by the Society of American Foresters. So that and lots of other programs, the Roots and Shoots, things like, I guess I'm drawing a blank now, but there are lots of those sorts of programs out there. But again, we can know something's wrong, but in order to fix it, there has to be a law that dictates what we can and can't do. The EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, was put into existence in 1970, and then that evolved the National Environmental Policy Act of the same year, which requires the federal government to consider what types of impact on the environment a project would have. So for example, if we're building a new bridge over the Sacramento River, there is a process that has to be followed. That process involves developing an environmental impact statement. So a team of people look at the biological situation. Building a bridge over a river, would that affect the fish? Would it have any positive or negative impacts on any other animals, the water quality, erosion, on and on and on. So these are fairly detailed documents that are required now anytime there's a type of project that could have any type of environmental impact. This also led to the establishing the Council on Environmental Quality, which deals with some of the enforcement issues. Again, laws are necessary, but then what makes people follow those laws? If the speed limit was 75 on Highway 5, but you knew the police were only out there Tuesdays and Thursdays from noon to 4, do you think people would go over the speed limit on the days they weren't there? Again, good or bad, yeah, I probably would too. If I knew there was zero chance of a cop giving me a ticket or giving you a ticket for speeding, going faster than the speed limit, I might be inclined to, go out there and see how fast my car can go if I'm in a kind of an open place. So with policy, there has to be enforcement. And again, that's always an ongoing, evolving issue. So it's the combination of developing policy that makes sense, that addresses whatever the problem is you're trying to fix, and then developing a enforcement policy where that policy can be monitored so that it's working as it's meant to work. So an environmental impact statement has to answer a number of questions for any project to go through. The process that's outlined here, this is a very simple version, obviously. And I just realized for some reason one of the images is upside down and backwards. But basically, whenever a major construction project is proposed, the first step really is that an environmental impact statement is prepared. Once that document is done, and that could take years, months, weeks, years, depending on how involved the project is, then that statement is released for public review and comment. Typically, there are public meetings. People can come and voice their opinions, concerns. The debate then, after a period of time, closes, and based on the feedback, the project may just proceed just as it was planned. Depending on the feedback, maybe they decide that the project needs to be modified. It can continue, but it needs to make some changes. Or if there's enough problem that arises with that public review, then maybe that project goes back and almost maybe starting from zero and going a different direction. Or the project just may be withdrawn totally and nothing ever happens with it. So again, it starts off based on science, but then there's economic input, social input, political input, and those three things are ultimately going to dictate whether or not that project goes through. So that would be the case, again, whether it's a solar field or a wind turbine farm or a bridge or a new road or anything else like that. All of those types of things are subject to an environmental impact statement. Some other important environmental legislation: the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. All of these address how we use our resources and what's allowable. The Clean Air Act, for example, doesn't say that you can't create any air pollution, but it does designate what is an allowable amount of air pollution. So factories that produce air pollution are regulated. They can produce a certain amount as based on the act, but not more than that amount. And there can be fines and penalties if they produce more air pollution than they're allowed to produce. Ultimately, the implementation and the enforcement of these regulations tend to be pretty much at each state. So the state has basically the responsibility to enforce these regulations, but ultimately the states do report back to the EPA. So it's kind of overseen by the government, where each state is responsible and stays in communication with the EPA with respect to these regulations. Quick note on this with respect to California. We have in California the most strict environmental regulations, not only of anywhere in the United States, but anywhere in the world. We had pollution laws back before there were national pollution laws. We were the first state that had the pollution or smog control on automobiles. I remember growing up in Wisconsin, I might be homesick from school on a day and watching daytime television, something like The Price is Right, which is based out in Los Angeles, and of course it's still going today. But somebody would win a prize and they would be talking about this car that they won, and they would always state that it has California emissions. And I never knew or understood what was meant by California emissions. Of course, now, looking back, I know that it was because California had much tighter air pollution laws, and so they required manufacturers to minimize the amount of pollution that automobiles were creating. And that law helped a lot in decreasing the pollution, especially in the large cities like Los Angeles. Even today, we still have the most strict regulations, whether it comes to air or water pollution, with respect to what foresters can do. Harvesting timber is very heavily regulated. Wildlife, all those things are more regulated in California than anywhere else in the country. For the better, but there also are things that make it more challenging then, and more expensive, obviously, for all of us. So there have been 40 major environmental laws since 1970, like the ones we've already talked about, but also including the Endangered Species Act, Energy Conservation Act, a variety of laws that deal with pesticides and water. We've had 15 national parks established since the 1970s, 15 new parks. We've reduced soil erosion because we know better how to avoid that now, thanks to, again, going back to the 1930s when Roosevelt established the Soil Conservation Service. Because of these laws, we've got a lot of endangered species that are recovering, or at least have not been driven to extinction. We've greatly improved our air quality. Still got a long ways to go, obviously, if you looked at any of the large cities. But think of how bad it would be now if not for these laws back in the 70s. We've already talked about how important economics is, so a little time here to define that. Basically, it's the study of how people use a limited resource to satisfy unlimited wants. So how do we use limited resources to satisfy unlimited needs or demands? And basically the fundamental component of economics is supply and demand, because that's what determines how much we pay for something. So the more demand there is for something, typically the higher the price. If something's in short supply, typically that means it's going to demand higher price. Precious metals like gold and silver are in relatively small amounts, so they're relatively valuable. As our petroleum continues to become less available and our demand is only going to continue to increase, that's why right now we're at $3 and some cents a gallon. It's why we were as high as $5, and it's probably why the gas prices are only going to trend up. Year to year, they might go up and down, but the trend is probably only continue to go up and up as there's less resource and more demand for it. So a country's economy ultimately depends on its natural environment. Again, nothing that we use on this planet doesn't come from our environment. We may manufacture things, synthetic products, but the base products, the base ingredients in those products still come from our environment one way or another. And so basically our environment is the source for our raw materials, but it's also the sink for the products that we throw away later on. So it's really a very large closed system. The stuff comes, it gets used, and then it gets thrown away all within our planet. Natural capital is defined as resources and processes that sustain living organisms. Again, a resource might be just the food that something needs to survive. But a process could be something like the water cycle. If the water cycle, the hydrologic cycle, stopped working, all life on this planet would be over, or at least 99.99% of it would be dramatically impacted. So it could be a resource or it could be a process that occurs in the environment. And we'll talk about things like nutrient cycling a little later. We also have to look at resource degradation, the overuse of a source to the point where it degrades it or makes it less available. And then again, ultimately, things like pollution, which is defined economically as the overuse of a sink. If we overuse an area, we create some type of pollution, whether it's air, water, something that creates pollution in the ground, like a landfill that leaks, or toxic waste that leaks into the environment. So there's an environmental insight that talks about economics and the environment and looks at things like the total income of goods and services for a given year, being the national income accounts. So again, basically we have these raw materials, our natural capital. So we have all these raw materials like trees, water, soil, air, and basically it's producing products from those items that feed the economy. So there's money moving around. And we, of course, buy those products. A lot of those products are either consumed directly, like food might be, or even that DVD player that you buy that eventually you throw away because you got a Blu-ray player. That's the equivalent of consumption because you used something and created a waste product. So it's the pulling products from the environment that create money flow, that power the economies. But again, where you have products coming into the flow, you also have products leaving the flow into the waste stream. So you have natural capital sources and natural capital sinks. You have raw materials flowing through the economy in the world and then ending up ultimately all as waste that has to go somewhere. Paper and paperboard products account for the majority of our waste, and we'll talk more about that later. But again, just so you have a basic understanding of how our natural capital drives economies and then still creates waste products at the end that we have to deal with somehow. So where we have these depletions of our natural resources, it's obviously bad for every aspect of the environment. If you deplete your cabinets of food, you got to find more food somewhere. Go to the store and buy it. But if we deplete our environment of its ability to provide for us, then where do we go to get the supplies? The other earth, which we don't have. So it's important to kind of realize the big picture here. So this section goes into the gross domestic product, which equals the NDP plus depreciation. And NDP is a measure of net production of economies after you deduce for used up capital, after you deduct for all the stuff that's consumed. And bottom line here, I don't want to get too bogged down in economic theory, because that's not my specialty anyway. You can take a class from Mr. Eckhart for that if you're on Shasta College. Probably some of you have. But basically, it's looking at the costs and benefits of using our resources. For example, what are the costs and what are the benefits of controlling pollution? So, obviously, factories that produce air pollution or water pollution are making products that we desire. Money we pay for those products feeds the economy, and everybody is able to survive. But to allow a factory to be built, things like looking at the cost and benefit of the pollution they're going to produce has to be taken into account. So all of that is looked at when we're deciding is the benefit of making this product for the people that demand that product, is that greater than the pollution that is going to be caused? Or if not pollution, it could be the byproduct, could be a chemical that's given off when you're making things like plastics. It could just be the amount of waste that's generated that has to be dumped somewhere, stored in a landfill. So again, we're always looking at cost and benefit when we're making environmental decisions. So that's specifically the economic side of environmental science. The cost and benefit of creating a product versus the damage it could cause to the environment. So what about an economist's view of pollution, say, versus a scientist view of pollution? A scientist would look at pollution as probably being all bad. There'd be no benefit of polluting the environment. It would be pretty much a negative thing 100%. But again, science is only one of those three legs. What about economy? Well, one cause of pollution is the failure to include external costs in the price of goods. So, for example, if you remove resources from the Great Smoky Mountain National Park, the resources removed wouldn't be reflected in the final cost of that. So if there's no cost in causing damage to the environment, if we could just, the highest bidder could win the bid to go into Yellowstone and start drilling for oil, basically we would do it. There would be no discouragement of us polluting, because it would be all about the economic side. So again, it's taking into account the costs and benefits of doing environmental type projects. Our most common example of an external cost is the air pollution that we create because we're burning fossil fuels in, for example, our cars to get to work or go to a movie or do whatever we do in our car. The full cost of generating that air pollution is not accounted for in the price of a car. We don't pay an extra $5,000 every time we buy a car to put that money into a pool to help clean the environment. Now, there are examples where that is the case. For example, if you've bought tires recently, if you've bought a television or some type of electronics, you pay a little extra money to account for when that product is used up for it to be recycled properly, so we're not dumping a bunch of stuff in the waste stream. We've got a CRV on our bottles that we buy here in California, right? That little bit of extra money you pay is money that is supposed to go towards the cost of recycling that plastic bottle. But again, some of the big stuff that really do the pollution, that really do damage to the environment, that external cost is not necessarily taken into account when that item is priced. So external costs are basically harmful environmental costs that ultimately are still paid for by us, but aren't directly involved in selling or buying that product, like I just said. Again, for example, when you release pollution by driving your car, it basically doesn't cost you any more or any less. So it encourages pollution. It's again the same idea that the people that live in the Bay Area, they have a really, really cheap source of water because of the Hetch Hetchy Dam. I remember a few years ago, somebody was lobbying that they ought to pay more for that water to account for basically the external cost of that water. And the people are so accustomed to it being really, really cheap that they fought and fought and fought against any little price increase. So if water is cheap, there's no reason for us to conserve it, right? If every time you go to your tap, there's water coming out of it, and you're paying $10 a month for water, what's to discourage you from washing your driveway off, overwatering your grass, wasting water, in other words? All the little things that we can do to help save water. Why should we do that if water's cheap and there's no penalty for using it in a wasteful manner? So it's kind of the same in this case. If those costs aren't put into the industries and they're borne by us, what's the incentive for the industry to pollute less? Because if the full cost of that pollution were paid for by the company, so again, if Ford and Chevy had to pay for the cost of the air pollution that their cars generate, car prices would probably double or triple from what they are now, and not all of us could afford to buy a car. So again, that's kind of where we are with the environmental economics. But again, it's unrealistic to believe that everything we do can be done in a completely pollution-free manner. So it's not about stopping all pollution, it's about asking the question, how much pollution is acceptable? So it's always a trade-off between protecting the environment's quality, but still producing those goods that we all need or want, need for survival, want just to have a quality of life. So it involves balancing the marginal cost, which is the added cost per item that we buy, of the pollution that's generated, and the marginal cost of the abatement. So the marginal cost of how much pollution is generated by that product, and looking at basically the cost of the industry minimizing that amount of pollution. So that's kind of just in a general sense shown on the graph on this page. But as pollution levels rise, the cost of damage increases sharply. So we see pollution, the amount of pollution across the x-axis, and the cost of basically the damage caused by the pollution in the y-axis. So again, as pollution levels rise, the cost of the damage to the environment increases as well. So we've got to find kind of a good place where we get the products, but we don't overly damage the environment. So the added cost then of further reducing the amount of pollution when we build an item, again, is shown by the graph on this page. Cost rises as the level of pollution declines. And so then why is there a downward slope associated with marginal cost abatement? Well, it's sort of like you can spend a little bit of money to make a difference, but then to start getting every little bit of pollution scrubbed out of a process, it takes more and more and more money to get that little bit of improvement. So that's why, again, this drops off dramatically. When the amount of pollution is lower, to get the amount of pollution lower, it costs a lot more because it gets harder and harder to get those last little bits of pollutant out of that process that we're using to manufacture something. So if we put these things together, we get the cost-benefit diagram. And at the point where the marginal cost of pollution meets with the point of marginal cost of pollution abatement, we basically have what's called the economically optimum amount of pollution. So we can go down that dotted line to the amount of pollution in tons, and that would be the optimal level to reach. It doesn't mean that we couldn't possibly, spend more money and create less pollution. But then again, the products go up because if the industry's putting more money into something, we're going to be the ones that pay for that. So there's always kind of the optimal level of pollution that could be generated in order to make something economically viable. So again, economics certainly isn't my strong point, but please do read through the book again. Make sure you're clear on these couple of definitions that are covered in this chapter. And I guess the bottom line is this diagram kind of does the great job of summarizing. There's always going to be that optimum amount of pollution from an economic standpoint that we're going to generate as an industry so that they can still make money, they can make their product cheap enough so that we'll buy it. And basically that's what companies are shooting for, generally speaking. So there are some, to end this chapter, there are some strategies for pollution control from the economic perspective. So we have the types of regulations that are called command and control regulations, where we have pollution control laws that work by setting limits on levels of pollution. So again, for different types of industry, there's a level that's set. You can't produce more than this much pollution. And so then it requires the industry to have a specific way or method of controlling that pollution. Or, so you can legislate they use a particular method, or you can legislate that they have a specific number they have to meet. So that's command and control. Incentive-based regulation basically are laws that establish target emission levels, and then when those companies meet or fall below those target levels, they provide them incentives. So they're almost subsidizing those industries. They're giving them benefits to reduce emissions rather than negatively enforcing. They're sort of positively reinforcing companies to create better technologies that result in fewer emissions. So rather than a punishment, it's an incentive. So these incentive-based regulations could be related to taxes, that gross polluters get taxed for polluting. But, it's kind of difficult to this point to really find a good way to determine an amount of money. Because again, ultimately, if they generate the pollution, then it's out there. How do we really know how much money it's going to take to mitigate that pollution? Then there's the idea of these tradable permits, which kind of could also be called, related to, I should say, carbon sequestration or carbon credits. So this still sets limits for how much pollution an industry is allowed to generate. But if one company or one industry pollutes less than their target, so let's just make up a number and say that an industry is allowed to produce 500 units of pollution. And let's say one industry only produces 150 units of pollution. They can actually sell their 350 units below what they're allowed to produce to another company that's over the 500. So again, in theory, you could have a cap of 500 units of pollution. You could have one company that's only producing 150 units of pollution, but you could also have another company that's producing 850 units of pollution, and the company that's producing less could sell their credits to the company that's selling more, so that company doesn't get any kind of fine or penalty. So, does anyone see a problem with that? Again, if you think about it, if the goal is to produce less than 500 units of pollution for everybody, is it really benefiting the environment to basically sell your pollution to somebody else? Because ultimately, what does that mean? Those two companies are still producing a combined 1,000 units of pollution, when it should be our goal that both of them are producing under 500 units of pollution. So what I'm saying is it doesn't really solve the problem. You know, you've got a certain amount of pollution that you're allowing, but if you allow some companies to produce more and pay for credits from another company, you're not really solving the pollution problem. So while it's a good theory, I would argue that it's a smokescreen. It doesn't really solve a problem. It's completely an economic solution. It's not an environmental fix. So there's a case study on this idea of tradable permits in relation to acid rain. The fact that the EPA regulated sulfur emissions, which is what causes acid precipitation, and we'll talk about that later. And this basically was amended even more recently in the 1990s and developed this cap and trade system where there were tradable sulfur emissions in order to reduce acid rain. But it turns out that it wasn't as successful as with maybe some other things, because it should encourage industries to adopt technology to reduce emissions. But again, if you're a wealthy company that's making more pollution than you should, and you have the money to just buy or trade credits from another company, the ultimate outcome is still the same amount of pollution. Not less pollution, but the same amount of pollution.